Hi everyone, so this is the second short video introducing you to the NES assessment grids. In this one I'm going to talk to you about how to input the data for your assessments, what it looks like, how to change your assessments, and then the effect that it has on the overall score for each pupil and for your class. I'll also talk to you briefly about how this is a working document and some tips on how you're going to be making those assessments as you go through the year. So the first thing you'll notice is that this sheet looks a little bit different from the one in the previous video. Obviously, we've got a full class of children along the top here, and we've got some assessments that have already been inputted for a few of the objectives. You'll also notice that it's mostly oranges and reds. This is because this is a snapshot of an assessment grid from early on in the year last year. And this is the sort of picture that we would expect within the first half term. Obviously, you've not covered enough content to have assessments for every objective, and you won't have enough evidence, perhaps, to assess anyone as meeting the expected standard or above. So you're most likely going to have lots of oranges and reds for the first half term or even the first full term as you gather evidence and the children make progress towards those objectives. What I'd like you to notice as well is that these blank cells here, they're not actually empty. These are obviously the cells that have not yet received any assessments. Perhaps you've not taught them or you've not gathered enough evidence in order to put any assessment data in for those objectives. They're not actually empty. If I have a look at the top left here, there's actually a 0 in each of these boxes. When there's a 0 in the box appears empty. And it's important that we remember that there must be a 0 in these empty boxes because it affects the overall average. You don't need to put the zeros in. They'll already be in there for your blank assessment grid. But when it comes to removing an assessment, maybe you've accidentally put an assessment in the wrong box, or you want to change your mind about whether or not you've received enough evidence to put an assessment in, rather than deleting the data in the box, you just need to put a 0 in. So for example, let's say I've accidentally put in an assessment for Thomas here. He's not exceeding. Maybe I've accidentally pressed that key. If I want to delete that data, I won't be pressing backspace or delete. I'll select the box. I'll type a 0 into that box. When I move away, it then goes back to a blank cell. Okay, so how do you put data in for these objectives? Once you've decided the scores that you've given your children for each objective, remember that we have the key at the bottom here, that the emerging, developing, achieving, and exceeding steps correspond to numbers, a 1 for emerging, a 2 for developing, a 3 and a 4 for achieving and exceeding. You're going to use those numbers to input the data into the grid. So if, for example, I've decided that I've seen enough evidence for Jana to say that she is developing confidence in consistent and correct use of tense, I would select that box for Jana for objective 9, and I would input a number 2. When I click off that box or move away from it using my arrow keys, you'll see that the color automatically changes, and that obviously corresponds here. Now that's what I was talking about yesterday when I mentioned the visual representation. Obviously, as you fill up this grid, you will be able to gain a visual idea of how the children are getting on individually against each objective, or overall against the whole curriculum, or even as a whole class. As I mentioned at the beginning, these colors indicate that most of my children are either emerging or developing in their skills against the Year 5 writing curriculum at this stage in the year, which would be normal. Okay. Now, as I go through and put in a bit more data, let's say that Noor is emerging, Nizar is emerging, Ragad, I decided, is developing. Perhaps Jude has produced some outstanding work and consistently shows me that her tense is excellent, and I feel confident in my professional judgment that she is meeting the expectations of the year group. I would give her a 3, and you can see that these colors correspond. Of course, I could give a 4 But blue was usually a colour that I wouldn't expect to see in an assessment grid until at least after the winter break, because in order to be exceeding the expected standard, those children need to be showing you that they can consistently exceed the expected standard in different genres of writing, different circumstances, and so on and so forth. The next thing to mention to you is the effect that it has when you put data into this grid. Now, obviously, you're putting numbers into these boxes, and those numbers correspond to how well the child is performing against the objectives based on the evidence that you've seen in class. Now, if I scroll down to the bottom here, I can see that there are 3 rows at the bottom of the grid. This is the same in every subject, whether it's maths, science, practical science, topic, or English writing. They will always appear, and I'll tell you what they refer to now. So this first one, objective points total, that tells you if the child scored a 4 for every single objective, that's the number of points that they would have. Okay, so that would be exceeding in every objective. Okay, the next one down, pupil total achieved, is how many points has each child scored at this point in time. So it's a simple total of the numbers that you've put into the boxes. Okay, and underneath here, that is then calculated as a percentage of the potential total. All right. So, for example, if I had a child that has met the expected standard for every objective, their percentage score would be 75% because they've scored a 3 for every objective. Okay. Now that is useful more towards the end of the year when you're comparing within and between your classes, as that data will help you sort of decide whereabouts each child sits with regards to your overall expectations. Have they met the expected standard or not? Okay, so I think that pretty much covers how to input the data. Okay, so inputting a 1, a 2, a 3, or a 4 into the corresponding box for the child and the objective will then give you a visual representation of that assessment, and then that will add to the total percentage at the end. The other thing that I wanted to briefly mention was to talk to you about how this document should be used throughout the year. It's really important. I think it's actually the most important thing to remember, that this is a working document. You will add to this, you will edit this, you will change your mind as you go through the year for all of these assessments. Once you've put an assessment in, by no means is that assessment set in stone. In fact, it's very important that it's not, particularly with subjects like writing, where you're going to see progress throughout the year with each child. Hopefully, by the end of the year, I'm going to be seeing most of these reds and oranges turn to green and even to blue in some cases where they're exceeding the expected standard. So never feel reticent in changing your mind. If you decide that Nizar actually has shown great progress and is now developing, you can change that quite happily. Okay, if you change your mind and think that, actually, Daphne has produced 2 more pieces of work and she's really struggling with objective number 5, she's not as confident as I thought she was, you can happily move her down to a 1. You won't get told off for that. That is the moving picture of the assessment that you have as your professional judgment for your children. In fact, seeing that those assessments are changing is usually a good signal to me and other members of SMT and your year head that you are thinking carefully about the decisions you're making for your children in their assessment. This probably isn't quite so much the case with discrete objectives. For example, in science, you're going to be teaching a unit for up to 6 weeks, after which you're not going to be revisiting any of the objectives from that unit. So if I go to science, for example, year 5 forces, I'll be teaching forces for 6 weeks. By the time I finish that unit, I'll have a full board of data for that unit for all of my children. I'm not going to come back and change that. So in that case, if it's a discrete unit or a discrete objective that you're not going to return to, then obviously that's going to be your final judgment for the year. So I would expect to see more greens and blues in discrete subjects or discrete objectives. Right, that's the end of that one. So yeah, again, if you've got any questions, any queries, then bung me an email or come find me. So that's, again, room 21, 5.2 classroom on the Year 5 corridor. Cheers, guys.